This week's theme is power. So we're going to look at a few aspects within this. The first video is going to give a very quick overview of castles. This was a bit of a struggle for me to condense into a short video. I will not lie, considering, they're one of my things. So remember that I do teach a whole upper level course on castles. But then we're also going to look at the material culture of weaponry. And then we're going to look at hunting and tournaments, which are ways that you might not think lords express power in the Middle Ages. So that's really the theme. We're kind of sticking with the elites this week, whereas we've tried to get to know the ordinary people more up until this point. We're back with the elites. So you definitely should read your textbook because like really top people, again, have written the sections of your textbook on this. Kieran O'Connor is one of the authors. I think he wrote in volume 2 the section on fortifications, and Kieran O'Connor was one of my on my PhD committee. I know him very well, so he is like a top-notch scholar. Okay, so we'll start off with castles, and let's consider their role in medieval society firstly. So we often say that if we're going to condense it, castles have three real functions in medieval society. They're a defence, they're a residence, and they are the most often overlooked, but still as important, administration centre. So when I talk about administration, it's where, like in the manor house that we talked about the other week, where court would be held, tax collection, where feudal swearing and obligations would be performed, lots of, administrative functions, a lot of them overlapping with the manorial functions we discussed before. So defence, administration and residence are the three traditional functions used to define what a castle is. And it's argued that these are the three minimum basic requirements for a building to be considered a castle. Without all three of these being present, it is argued that it is not a castle. We can probably add more to this, though. In particular, I think the public-private debate, which we've talked about, should be applied as a fourth element, because castles are private defences. So I think, well, maybe qualify the defence aspect to say private defence, because if you think about communal defence, then you're dealing with towns, the town walls we talked about in an earlier class, or we're talking about fortifications rather than castles. So I think that it's the private defensive function, and likewise that the residence is for the lord and the immediate the family, whether immediate or extended, and the retainers. So I think while it's still not our modern view of private, and we've talked about privacy versus public before, it's not as private as we might consider privacy today. It's certainly not communal. But there's lots of other functions castles had. One of them that's very important is the symbolic centre. We're going to talk about that shortly. But it's also a manorial centre, as we know. So that makes it an economic centre as well. And my research has argued that we too quickly overlook the economic aspect of these castles, which, as much as we're going to see our lords did not really want to be looking after their estates necessarily, they had more entertaining things to do. They still have to get their money from somewhere. They could also be religious centres. For sure, they were focal points within the landscape, but also within their society. I've argued they oftentimes, especially the tower houses, which we'll get to shortly, could have had a commercial use. We're going to see how they operated as hunting seats, as farms. They reinforced aristocratic identity. That's a theme for this class. And of course, they are perhaps material culture of feudalism. Now, obviously, feudalism, the bad F word, is debated to what extent it existed. But if we want to we start to brainstorm what items of material culture might be most associated with feudalism, we probably put the castle towards the top of the list. Now, I've just given you a list of possible functions. These vary depending on the castle itself. Not all of these might be present at a castle. For example, my research on tower houses found that I found a couple that I could not find any full-time occupational evidence for, instead that they were temporarily occupied. So that brings the residence role into question. Surprisingly few castles are offensive. They're definitely defensive rather more than an offensive. The exception is maybe some crusader castles, which were used as a base for attack. We're going to look at earthwork castles shortly, that is moats and ringworks. But those seem to have been used to secure an already conquered area rather than used as bases for military expansion. Debates are over whether castles therefore reflect social instability. Are they built manifestations of social instability? I think yes, but at the same time we think of instability as being a bad thing. I think instability provides opportunity also. So to just condense it to the fortified residence of a noble or wealthy man and his entourage is pretty limited when we start looking at them as a whole. They're actually multifunctional and really quite complex, and the roles also shift depending on the time and the place. Castles were the residence of the nobility, and I've got man there, but of course an area of increased interest is the role of women in castles, and Karen Dempsey is thankfully starting to really redress that balance by trying to identify physical spaces associated with women in castles. So it is a residence of the nobility, it's a centre of political, social, economic, military, and sometimes even religious command. And it's where protection and exploitation were exercised together. Those two things are inseparable. It is indeed what we consider a very visual, material culture symbol of feudal society. And indeed, this is reinforced by the fact that, for example, the Crusades, when the Crusaders established the Crusader states, they import the castle along with their social systems. But there's a lot of symbolism in the architecture and built form of castles. Oh, I flicked ahead too soon. So if you are considering looking at a castle from far away, just evoke the sort of traditional image of a castle in your head. Think about the bits that you're going to see first. You're going to see the tops of the castles first. There's often a lot of details up at the roof level. This is so that it strikes people from as far distance as possible. It's both pretty, it's done to look attractive, but also to convey oftentimes a military message. This is also might be where we find the best showy-offy bits, and they might evoke grander schemes like classical architecture. Now, castles today, when we think about them, like look at this one on the right, this is Beaumaris, we're going to come back to this shortly. It's, we think of the grey stone, but probably castles would have been whitewashed because they need to protect that stone and the mortar. So this, if it's painted white, will of course be even more striking against the backdrop. White against green, if you can imagine Beaumaris there being bright white, although it probably wasn't because it was never finished, but you know what I mean. It's going to really, really stick out in the landscape, be very obviously material. And then as you get closer, you're going to see more details. You're going to see the arrow slits, the gun loops, the windows, the decorative stones. And then as you get into the castle, you're going to see the entranceway, the gatehouse. And this might be where if you have a date stone or a heraldry so that people can, enter and you're making a social claim at the same time. So the castle, therefore, tends to materially unfold at different levels, different stages depending on how far away you are from it, but also who you are. Because if you're a peasant, you're going to see a very different side to the built manifestation of a castle than another lord. So castles often have different faces to reflect this multifunctional space that they are. So, for example, as we approach, we often say, oh, it's very militaristic, but then when you get inside, it might actually be very comfortable because it's also got to be a residence. So this is castles as a whole, but let's have a look at the main types of castles. We're going to start off with what we call earthwork castles, or earth and timber castles, because we tend to forget about the timber aspect, and you'll see exactly why on these pictures. Okay, so the first example we've got here is a type called a motte. A motte is distinguishable because it's an earthwork base, earth base, and it looks, if you are identifying it, it looks like an upside down Christmas pudding. So it's like a raised mound, but with a flat top, because you put stuff on top of the flat top. As you can see here, this is a very well studied and excavated motte castle from Wales called Hen Domen, and the top two pictures are what it looks like today. So you see why the timber becomes important, because it doesn't really look like much today. Preservation is a real issue with this type of castle. Farmers use these fields, they plough them, erosion is a problem, trees and bushes can also be a problem, and you can see on the picture in the top right of Hen Domen there's lots of trees which perhaps keeps animals out, but at the same time the roots can be destructive. Now, we're working roughly chronologically forward with our castle types, mottes, and then the next slide is going to be ringwork castles, and those are built from they're high medieval, but they're the earliest in the high Middle Ages. There's examples being built in France and Germany in the 10th century, but they are built for several hundred years, this type of castle. So this is very important to remember, that these types of castles, these earth and timber castles, were built at the same time as the best known stone castles. Because when I asked you to imagine a castle just before, I bet it was a stone one you were imagining. It's not that these earth and timber castles were built by poorer or less impressive individuals. That's not true. These were built by wealthy, powerful folk. So it's not simply a case of once people are able to build castles in stone, they exclusively build castles in stone. We know that there's a lot more complex motivations going on for their choice of material culture. They're very hard to categorize because we don't see the timber that medieval people would have found the most noticeable and striking. So the bottom here is a recreation of Hen Domen, and you can see that it's got the attached bailey as well, and they've drawn in buildings and a tower on the top of the motte and wooden access stairs. That's probably an underestimation of how much timber was involved, because if we think back to when we were talking about our timber buildings in urban and rural environments, remember that good quality building timber is a status good. We think that urban vernacular buildings had more timber in them because of the social and status element, and as we know, people love to show off with their buildings. Therefore, it's very likely that medieval people will have been really impressed the more wood that you put on your earth and timber castle. So while we see the earth bit, probably a medieval person did not see very much earth. So we're kind of looking at the most bizarre bit to them, we reckon. We therefore are relying on excavation, but a problem with excavation is going to be, as we know, organic material preservation. We might look at sources like the Bayeux Tapestry. On the Bayeux Tapestry, there are some depictions of buildings, including this one, where they are actually building a castle. But Bayeux Tapestry can be misleading. It looks like, if you look at this the construction, this is Hastings Castle, saying that the castellum at Hastings Caestra, it's being constructed. These guys, they actually have like spades there, that's what they're digging, and the guy on the right's got a hoe. It looks, if you look at the motte is behind, it's got a stripy bottom on it, and it looks like that suggested to earlier scholars that mottes had lots of layers involved, that they maybe put layers of stone and then earth and then other, to strengthen the base so that they could build a tower on top. This one on the top might be a tower, or it might just be a palisade surrounding it and then other buildings in. But the problem with this is most of them do not have this kind of variegated bottom on them. They're just, thrown up out of earth. So this source can be a bit misleading. Now, mott's, as I said, they originated, we think, in France and Germany, but they are found right across Europe, from Ireland in the west to Poland in the east and Scandinavia in the north, and southwards as far as Anglo-Norman Sicily, but they are less common around the Mediterranean area and the Iberian Peninsula. There's another type of earth and timber castle called a ringwork castle, and these were probably quicker to throw up than mott's to construct. This meant that for a long time the ringwork was kind of viewed as the poor cousin of the mott, but now the scholarship tends to view them as being an alternative to the mott. Of course, we look at it and we're like, oh, well, it's much lower. It doesn't have this like tall mound at the center of it. But of course, if it's going to have buildings and it's got lots of timber on it, it's still, we need to remember, would have been a very visible landscape symbol and would have held a lot of importance for the local population. Ringwork seemed to have been like adapted quite commonly from pre-existing fortifications. And Kieran O'Connor, this is one of his favourite things to talk about, so I hope he talks about it. I can't remember off the top of my head in the article that he's written in your textbook. But if not, one of his favourite things to talk about is how many castles are actually just constructed out of something that was already there, that is maybe Roman or Iron Age in date. There's a very simple reason for this. It's easier. You've got a lot less construction to do if you're starting with something that's pre-existing. It's very practical. Also would have provided some shelter and defensive capability during the period of construction, save time and labour, and then of course there's all the symbolism, especially if you're like the Normans, say, and you've just arrived in England from Normandy, you take over a Roman fort and start building on top of that. Well, there's a very strong symbolic element there. Oh, we're the new Romans, we're the new arrivals, you better behave yourselves. We have all the same issues from a material culture perspective with the ringworks as mott's, perhaps even more so, because as you can see, it's defined by the bank and ditch system. It makes it pretty hard to identify them compared to other things with banks and ditches, and also easier to bulldoze, basically. Now, of course, when we think of castles, we think of the masonry examples. Stone castles are mainly a 12th century development in terms of the large numbers anyway. They definitely were around before then, but they really start to boom in numbers from the 12th century. But the origins probably go back to around the year 1000. The trend for masonry castles in terms of their architecture moves from this on the right. This is a keep, derived from the words keep or coop, and that's because it's telling you it looks like a barrel, to more of a focus on the surrounding walls and the gatehouses. And you're going to see that in the examples that we come to shortly. The masonry castles are really therefore a feature of castle building throughout the Middle Ages. Other words for this type of structure include donjon, the French word, or dominarium. Now, if you know any Latin or, are a good linguist, then you'd be like, hey, isn't dominus lord? Yeah, lordship? Yes. So by calling this building the dominarium, they're reflecting that this is a material culture artifact integral to the display of lordship. Now, we can really see this display of lordship if we look at the castles that scholars agree are kind of like the height of castle building. And these are particularly seen in the Crusader states in the east, but also Savoy, which is a modern day area between France and Italy, and also Wales. So Wales is a really interesting example. Here we're back with Beaumaris Castle. This was built by the English king, Edward. It was the last one that he built in Wales, but Edward conquered Wales in the 13th century. As part of his conquest of Wales, once he had completed conquest of an area, he built a really big, imposing castle to secure the territory that he'd gained, but also the symbolism. Very, very important here. Beaumaris was the last one that he was building. He built it in 1295. It was built as a a built manifestation of Edward's response to the revolt of the Welsh prince Madog ap Llywelyn in 1294 to 1295. So he was building this as like a statement of his power over the native Welsh population, which he had just subdued. Beaumaris is in the far northwest of Wales. It's on an island, the island of Anglesey. As you can see from the bottom picture, there was a town already there. That was a favourite thing for Edward to do, or to import his own people to live in the town. Anglesey was a very significant place at the time. In the 13th century, it was a commercial centre. It was a native Welsh royal manor. There was a Franciscan friary already there. There was a ferry there. There was, you can see from the bottom picture, good harbour, lots of fisheries, and indeed the island of Anglesey was referred to as the breadbasket of Wales. So this was a very wealthy place by medieval standards. So we know that Edward had been there before he constructed this castle. He was there in 1282. Edward had been off on crusade. He was a big castle fan. He probably visited and was like, you know what, when I get the opportunity, this is going to be a brilliant place to build a castle. And 1294-95, with this rebellion, provided him the ideal opportunity. It would have formed a beachhead if necessary, because there was lots of easy access to this good harbour from both England and Irish ports. We have written evidence, we think, for the first workmen arriving here, 50 diggers, 21 carpenters. So even in a masonry castle, that tells us that wood, timber, was an important element that we just don't see today. Possibly they were there to set up camp for workmen to follow, because in 1295, the surviving documents tell us there were 300 diggers, 30 carpenters, and 20 masons there. What you see there was built in less than a year. This is a huge accomplishment by medieval standards. In contrast, one of his other major castles at a place called Carnarvon, that was built over 40 years. So the fact that what you see here is built in roughly a year is pretty whoa. Never had so much money been spent on one castle before. Much of the building materials had to be imported by water. It cost a lot of money. It's been estimated that the total number of workmen at its height after this initial setting up period, there probably were 1,800 guys working on this building, because we don't see the quarriers. And they think that maybe there were 375 people working at quarries to excavate stone for this castle. It had to have a garrison to protect it of 10 men, 20 crossbowmen, and 100 infantry. The request for money to make sure that this building was done in time indicates that they weren't just scared of the native Welsh coming and attacking them when they were still constructing it, but actually also the French and the Scots, because they could sail there easily. So what this castle is while it was never finished, what we're seeing here is kind of as far as it got, and then it brings in the whole question of, is it as impressive because it was never finished? Is it really a castle because it was never put to its original intention? But it is what we call concentric design. And this is kind of like the apogee, we call it, of castle building, the concentric design. Concentric because of circles. There's many, many layers of circles. This is the architectural high point of castle design. So you can see, even if we go to the furthest part, there's a moat. And this moat was controlled by a watermill, actually kind of flushed the toilets as well. So moat's not very nice. And then there's multiple layers of walls. These mural towers, that's what we call, remember, the towers that are built within walls. They provided, the larger ones were accommodation bases. And they had private bathrooms. Whereas the outer walls had communal latrines. Beaumaris has a very high number of bathrooms, actually. They are referred to in the sources as petites maisons, little houses, and most of these are up in the wall walks. They even had ventilation shafts. There's still evidence there for doors and toilet seats, and they could be flushed by using the mill to bring the tide in from the sea and flush out the moat. High-tech bathrooms. The central tower on the east side is the most elaborate. It had a chapel in it, so there's also religious connotations there. Private viewing galleries as well, which doubtless were intended for the king. They plant 5 separate apartments within the castle, possibly for administrative functions or maybe for royal family to live there. We're not too sure. So these Welsh castles show the full architectural development of the castle, and they also illustrate the importance of symbolism, because think about all the messages that this building is going to send to the native Welsh, whose rebellion they have just broken down. Although this is only one of many Welsh castles built in the context of warfare, it had a lot more subtle rules as well. The time and expense that they spent on the residential aspects remind us that these were also key to castles. After this time, very few large masonry castles were newly constructed, though updates and improvements continue. Instead, we find as we move on into the tail end of the High Middle Ages and on into the Late Middle Ages, smaller types of castles like these. These are tower houses. In Scotland, they're called peel towers or bastles. They're also called that in England, but they're kind of the same building form. They're simple, smaller towers. They've kind of got a rep of being lesser castles, but actually a huge range of people built them. People at the time called them castles too. A small stone towers at the centre, but there might have been timber examples. Of course, though, across the board, we've talked about how difficult it is to know about timber buildings making up a wider complex, and that really does apply to the tower houses as well. They also had exactly the same functions as the earth and timber castles and the big masonry ones as well. These tower houses in Scotland, Ireland, they're all over the place. They're in Greece, in Spain, they're even in Eurasia. They are built and proliferate at the same time as castle architecture really goes out of popularity in the likes of Germany and France and the south of England. But they chronologically follow on from the likes of Beaumaris. Why are they so popular in some places and not others? That has not really been answered very well yet. It might be that in some areas there's a move to undefended, more spacious manor houses, and more of an emphasis on comfort, because you know what, these tower houses, they might look cool, but I would not want to live in one of them. They're dark and damp inside. They're rotten. But another reason why we probably have so many of them and from all these different parts of Europe is that because they're smaller and we're dealing with a society that is in transformation because of the Black Death, there's more of the middling sort of people or lower gentry or the likes of who had been knights who have money to spend on their built material culture than ever before. So we find when we look at those builders, we can identify that the tower houses were built by lesser lords, minor nobility, local lords, bishops, abbots, ecclesiastics, rich merchants, but also by the powerful magnates who would have built the great big stone castles. So they seem to have been a real attractive building form for people who could afford it from all walks of life. Now, I'm going to stop this video on castles and we're going to come back to other smaller material culture dominations of displays of power. What I want you to do now is go to Moodle. On Moodle, there is a source, and it was written by a guy called Luke Gernon. He was writing in the early 17th century, but what he writes about is applicable to the earlier period in Middle Ages too. I want you to read this source, and I want you to then answer the open question here on Nearpod about what this source tells us about the material culture of lords, that tells us about warfare and about castles. Because Gernon is writing about a visit that he made to one of these tower houses. Now, some of the words are like, and if you open it in Word, there's plenty of like red squiggly lines underneath, and you'll be like, oh my God, this does not make any sense. Okay, top tip. And this is a good rule of thumb for anything that you read in history that's awkward. So, you know, if you're in like Dr. Santoro's class and she's got you reading stuff from Colonial, the same rule applies. Read it out loud. You know, if you don't want your family and friends laughing at you for stumbling over words, read it out to your pet or by yourself. But if you read it out loud, it's amazing how quickly it makes sense. Because if you read it, you're like, why are there so many E's on the end of this? It makes no sense. Then you read it out loud and you're like, oh, I know what that word is. So Gernon's source looks hard, but I want you to read it out loud. I want you to get the practice in reading awkward transcriptions of historic sources. So read it out loud and see what you make of it.